"33 years ago, as a young Peace Corps volunteer, I stepped off a plane in Zaire. I remember being blasted by a wave of heat. Now, I'm from Texas, so I know heat, believe me. But this heat was different, and it was saturated with the smell of human feces and trash. I thought I was prepared for these conditions that I'd heard about, but this experience shook me to my core. I remember when I arrived at the village where I was stationed, the shocks continued. People were living in mud huts and were using a hole-in-the-ground latrine located just a short distance from their house. I began living like this as well. During my time in Africa, I met many amazing people. I saw how they lived. I attended village weddings, funerals, and witnessed illnesses. My world began to expand, and I started to realize that despite our circumstances, all humans are interconnected. We are more alike than we are different. One of the things that impacted me most deeply was how many people, especially children, were infected with intestinal worms. These intestinal worms are one of the most common infections worldwide and affect the poorest and the most deprived communities. Have you ever seen one of these? This is a guinea worm. They can grow up to about 1 meter long, which is about 3 feet, or the size of a 4-year-old. I remember being in Mali and seeing this woman sitting on a wooden stool, and she was rolling and twisting this worm out of her body on a plastic pin. What shocked me most was that this entire process, this entire disease, is 100% preventable. After completing my 4 years of Peace Corps in Africa, I returned back to the States, not only with a fascination for worms, but I actually brought some back with me. Or should I say, in me. It turns out while I was in Africa, I contracted schistosomiasis, a parasitic worm. This disease is second only to malaria as most devastating. But fortunately for me, I had immediate access to treatment and recovered quickly. Do you feel squeamish at the sight of these worms? I was once too, believe me. But now, I love worms. I mean, they've become a huge part of my life. Well, the study of worms and how we can prevent and control them globally. Over the course of my career, I have become an expert in neglected tropical diseases in Africa and Asia, specifically intestinal worms. So, let's open this can of worms, shall we? No, not these. Let's look at some statistics. According to the World Health Organization, in January 2022, approximately 1.5 billion people are infected with soil-transmitted helminths, the formal name of intestinal worms. That translates into 1 in every 5 people on the planet. Intestinal worms can be transmitted through contaminated food, water, and some can penetrate through our skin, typically the soles of our feet. Hearing that, you might think, I live here in the States, worms won't affect me. Well, in fact, they're a thing here too, and maybe a little bit closer than you can imagine. A study conducted in Alabama between 2010 and 2018 and published in the American Journal for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in 2022 looked at Medicaid claims for children and identified that both hookworm and roundworm were prevalent among these children. These studies in Alabama were so significant, they got the attention of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and finally Congress. This should not be happening. Since then, Congress has allocated funds to CDC to take a more in-depth look. Let's bring it a little bit closer to home. These are pinworms, found right here in children in Georgia. If you include the pinworms that still cycle elementary schools, everybody on the planet, yes, every single person, either has worms, has had them, or is going to get them and is at risk at the diseases they generate. So, how do we go about solving this problem? As I mentioned earlier, some of the bigger issues to be addressed are around safe water and proper sanitation globally. These are issues that absolutely need to be tackled on a global scale in order to prevent and control intestinal worms. Regarding treatment for intestinal worms, a single tablet taken twice a year and only costs pennies on the world market. In my job, I get to work with companies that donate these tablets primarily to people living in Africa and Asia. So, what is obvious about intestinal worms is they are parasites that need human hosts to survive. And they can cause serious health issues such as anemia and malnutrition. What is not obvious about intestinal worms is what benefits they might have for us, what they might be able to teach us. Remember when there was only one case of COVID-19 in Wuhan? Today, everyone has been impacted by it worldwide. We have all been challenged to make decisions and take actions in ways we never previously imagined. We've all had to make choices around social distancing, mask, quarantine, vaccinations. Are sources of information in a widespread culture of dividing us rather than bringing us together. We are now being asked to consider the greater good and take actions based on our needs as humans, together. Today, there's no longer a them. There is only us. We can no longer isolate ourselves from world issues and pretend that those issues are going to go away, including intestinal worms. We are interconnected. We are travelers, refugees, immigrants. We are global citizens. These diseases have no borders. No one is immune. So, when you see people living with intestinal worms, I challenge you not to turn away and think, this doesn't affect me. Instead, I invite you to treat the problem like it impacts us all, because it does. So what can you do? Be aware. Talk to your friends, your colleagues. Put pressure on your elected officials. Find ways in your communities to take action. Intestinal worms are solvable if attention is drawn to them and political will and resources put toward them. 33 years ago, I could have never imagined that my path would lead to this kind of work. My grandfather, a merchant marine, came from the Philippines for a better life. He married my grandmother, a beautiful, intelligent Choctaw woman from Alabama. Their courage provided the foundation for me to expand my life. We are all in this together. We can do this. We can keep worms out of human bodies, especially children's. I encourage you all to seek out information about intestinal worms and how you can get involved in this important issue. Thank you all for coming along on this journey with me.